and it's an opportunity for
This meeting is being recorded.
Sorry, I just started the recording. We're 2 minutes from starting, so I just wanted to make sure the recording was on.
Okay.
All right, we're starting to get people showing up, so we should be quiet for a couple minutes and then I'll introduce you.
Okay.
Good morning all, and we intend to start right at 11 a.m. So we'll be starting in 1 minute.
These classes are useless.
Good morning and welcome to our session on managing consent under Bill 64. I'd like to introduce my co-host, David McInerney from Serenus. They run a preference management center called CASI. And David is as much an expert on consent globally as we get. My name is Derek Lackey. I run Newport Thompson. And I'm also the chairman of the Response Marketing Association. And I really got involved with privacy due to, as chairman of the Response Marketing Association about 10 years ago, I saw privacy becoming a very serious issue for marketers and business people in general, because I felt that the changes were wanting to happen, and the GDPR really triggered the significant change. But all that said, to say it's arrived in Canada. So Quebec, as they did in 1993, when they introduced provincial legislation, privacy legislation, they were first, and they forced the federal government to introduce PIPEDA in 1999. So it took the federal government at that time 6 years to react. We think it's going to take them a lot less to react this time. Revisions to PIPEDA were already at least being discussed and tossed around. But once again, Quebec leads the way. And, you know, one of the things I do like about Bill 64 is it is designed exclusively to protect Quebec citizens. There is no talk of balanced approach where making it convenient for business as well as protecting consumers' data. They went right for GDPR level, protect the individual, give them some rights, give them some privacy rights. So maybe we should start with exactly that, David, the scope. Like, you know, a lot of people would think, why is it important for me to worry about a Quebec law when I'm in Ontario or Alberta or, but the fact is This isn't about where you're located. This is about where the citizen whose personal data you're capturing and using in some way, it's where they're located. And
Yeah.
and 22.5% of the Canadian population is based in Quebec. So it stands to reason that any national database has 20 to 25% Quebec residents on their list. Therefore, Bill 64 applies.
That's right.
So one of the things I'd also like to clarify is Bill 64 changed 21 different acts. So it was a privacy bill that impacted 21 different Quebec acts. The two we're most concerned about are the act respecting the access to documents held by public bodies and the protection of personal information. That is the government law or the public bodies law in Quebec, as it's called. And then there's a private sector one called the Act Respecting the Protection of Personal Information in the Private Sector, or PPIPS is the acronym for it. That's really the one we're talking about today, predominantly because we're talking about the private sector and we're talking about the new obligations under this new tough law. The thing that struck me the most about it was the GDPR, which we have everybody around the world considers to be a very tough standard for privacy.
Yeah.
It had 3 lawful bases for the private sector. It had 6 lawful bases entirely in section, it doesn't matter what the article was, but there are 6 lawful bases for processing personal information. 3 of them are available to the private sector. The 3 are consent, contractual, and legitimate interest.
Yeah.
And consent being really hard to get in a marketplace where the consumer doesn't trust businesses with their personal information, consent is tough to get. So even the GDPR recommends that consent be your last choice of those 3, right? Much to our surprise, Quebec left legitimate interest out, and 95%, like you know this better than I do, but I believe 95% of the business being done in the EU is being done under the banner of legitimate interest.
Well, yeah, absolutely, Derek. There is that sort of the ability to sort of level it against legitimate interest. I think that would pose a lot of problems for organisations within Canada. That you have to have consent against that specific purpose. So you need to sort of list out the purpose of why you're capturing that consent, and you're not able to have a catch-all consent option that covers you for everything. So
yeah, there is a little latitude in the way they wrote the law that, you know, if it's for I forget the actual legal phrasing, but if it's for the consent you asked for and anything associated with it, like there's a little bit of wiggle room for you to do something, but you can't, like at a retail store, for example, at the cash register, say, you know, Mr. McInerney, we'd like your email address so we can send you a receipt, and then add you to my email promotion list where you're getting hundreds of email marketing messages a month, right? That is stretching purpose limitation way too far, because you would have given the consent in that circumstance to the retail clerk, understanding that you were only giving consent to email your receipt.
Yes.
That's what's meant by a purpose limitation, right? It used to be that whatever little devious method we could get to collect your email address or any personal information on you, you know, we skulked around and grabbed it and used it whatever way we want. And all these new laws are changing this, right? The GDPR set that standard.
GDPR GDPR legislation demands that you offer transparency and choice to the individual, and that you're open and honest, and it means that the consent, and I guess in terms of Quebec, if we align it to that, it needs to be meaningful consent. So you need to prove that you've obtained the consent in a meaningful way, and that is, simply put, that you need to identify what personal information you're collecting, who you're going to share it with, what's the purpose of you collecting that personal information, and how long are you going to hold it for, basically. And that needs to be, I guess, freely available to the consumer if we're looking at a retail journey, and they need to be able to retract, withdraw. They need to be able to alter that consent freely at any given time. So and I think that's different in Canada, isn't it, Derek? That up until now you haven't actually had to prove that you hold meaningful consent. You can just you have been able to assume that you've got consent because of whatever the reasons are, but you don't have to prove that you've obtained consent in a meaningful way.
I would suggest that there is, under Castle, there is a requirement for proof. But it's not being enforced. So
exactly.
I doubt that too many companies have felt that their records of processing have to be kept, right?
But I think that is going to change with Bill 64. I mean, I think for all the articles that I've read, Derek, it says that it gives them the teeth that they maybe didn't have previously, and that they are going to, it favours the consumer more, and they are going to enforce it. And you've seen it in Europe and across Europe. There are more active commissioners that are fining because consent hasn't been obtained in the right way. There's case law examples under the GDPR where they are issuing fines under Article 5, but fines have been issued. But we've never sort of entered into the space as ambulance chasers saying it's all about the fines. We have an approach where we're engaged with organisations that see it as a positive thing, as a way of engaging with their end users in a way that they haven't had to do before, but embrace it and see it as an opportunity of positive change within an organisation.
Yeah, with change, forever, any form of change, that's where opportunity lies.
Yeah.
And I think we're finding, even with Castle, we're now 7 years out, Castle being coming into force, and people who made their lists smaller but more engaged are actually getting better results. So their email marketing, it's like, oh, wait a minute, this online conversation isn't necessarily a mass market. It's a learn to do it right and then scale it, rather than just throw enough against the wall and hope something sticks, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think those days are.
Yeah, because I don't know about you, but I think you just end up with a wall full of something, right?
Yeah, yeah, that's one way of putting it. But I think that if you put the power into the consumer's hands and let them determine how often, frequently you contact them, the subject matter that you contact them on, and give them that choice, then it does everything to strengthen your brand and does engage that consumer more. So there is a propensity to spend more if it's a retail, if we're continuing with that retail analogy, because they trust you, they trust your brand, they trust what you're doing with their data, with the individual's data, and they're more engaged because the organisation has a clear outlines clearly what they're going to do with the data, and that trust element is built between the organisation and the end user.
Yeah, And, 90% of the data we're collecting today is online. So being able to, effectively use web forms and preference centers and automating that, in other words, is probably a pretty critical conversation, right?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. I think any organisation that's embarking on a journey of compliance around Bill 64 will come to a point where they'll need to operationalise and automate that process. And this isn't an advertorial. I'm not here to sell my platform, although that is the intention. There are plenty of tools out there that will do a job for you, but you will need to you'll need to perform a gap analysis as part of the journey that you're embarking around Bill 64. And I think we're going to cover that off in one of the later sessions that we've got planned. But, you'll arrive at a point where a consultative organisation that you're engaged with will tell you that you'll need to introduce some technology to your stack to automate the process.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the kinds of technologies that do exactly what you're talking about. They operationalize a particular aspect of compliance. Some of these larger, platforms that have popped up that are all about all of privacy, I just don't find are as useful as some specific tools that serve a specific operationalized job. The whole idea here is to implement privacy in the company.
Yes.
And it's about changing one's practices. And, to that end, marketers have not had to manage and have processes, and they have not worried at all about capturing consent, or for the most part. For the most part. And now all of a sudden there's a legal requirement that looks like the CAI, the information office in Quebec, have been given the powers to fine. And from everything we're seeing, they're quite anxious to get out there and start fining.
Well, yeah. And you don't want to be on the wrong end of an investigation and a fine.
Yeah. So as much as
intention.
Yeah, as much as this should be about taking care of your customers, there's also a reality of you don't want to be any of the early fined organizations.
No, I mean reputationally that would be quite damaging to an organisation, given that there's 16 months until the full legislation comes into effect, but there's actually only 4 months before there are certain obligations that you will have to have undertaken that will hang against the CEO of an organisation. So I think the one that jumps out is around the appointment of a DPO, but and that comes from the CEO down. But in our experience, people really should be starting the journey now, as it were, if they haven't done already, because data flows through every aspect of a business. So you need to have every aspect of your business involved in how this introduction of legislation will affect the processes that exist within an organisation, or in many cases that they probably won't have this process in place. I don't think, because if they haven't had to do it previously, then they won't have done it in some instances. I would have thought. I would argue, but
I agree.
It's down to every organisation to look at the data flow between their organisation and where they capture the consent and the systems that need to honour that consent and to use that consent for a business to be able to continue to function. So it's introducing additional process in some instances, but it's ensuring that an organisation is able to continue to operate as they are today, but with the legislation that's coming.
So true consent management, when you've operationalized it properly, and if you use an automated solution, it should plug into your back end where the data is actually used and the consumer's preferences are communicated to MailChimp, for example, regarding email preferences, to Salesforce regarding, call center practices. But that data needs to be routed to where it's actually being used. And that's one of the things I love about these new consent management platforms is it empowers the consumer to make their choice in a very clear, understandable way. And that data, nobody in the company has to touch it. It actually goes to where it needs to in order to be implemented and operationalized. And that's one of the things. That's one of the things I love. I love about the consent management platforms. And again, previously there was no need to track this. Nobody bothered, but now there's a need to track it.
Yeah.
And people are starting to go, oh my God, how do I do this? Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, and there's two boxes, and generally there's two boxes that you need to tick. I would have thought that one around compliance, so keeping that DPO who's appointed happy in terms of the process has been followed, and you have the ability to demonstrate that you're holding meaningful consent in the right way. But the other problem that an organisation will encounter is that sort of enablement of marketing. So the marketing function can still work in the way that it has done, and marketeers aren't waiting for systems to update, aren't looking over their shoulder, have the confidence that the data that they're extracting for a campaign, they can use, and that's what it comes down to basically. That they have that it's been used for the right purpose, and that they hold the right consent for that. And I think that that's what organisations should be looking for, is that they should be looking to engage with vendors that have solutions that can give them that sort of flexibility.
Well, the other thing I wanted to make, underline here, because it's important, the enforcement bodies, like in GDPR, the DPAs, they're never investigating you for your consent right now, like today. They're always coming to you with an order to produce. 6 months, 12 months back, what were Derek Lackey's preferences, right? And most of us don't have a process or a system set up to be able to tell and answer that very simple question. And the only fair way for the enforcement body to operate is to assume if they can't see it, touch it, and feel it, it doesn't exist. So one of the things your consent management process has to have is the ability to go back to a day in time, a single point in time, and state exactly what my preferences were on that date. And and so even computer logs on web forms and stuff, it's hard to keep track of it unless you have a system for doing so, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it needs to be something that you need to have an immutable record, not something that's merged down.
That's the phrase I was looking for. An immutable record that you can't go in and fudge. It's like.
And you're right, Derek. When somebody comes to investigate you, they're not going to say, what does David McInerney's profile or consent options look like on the 18th of May?
Yeah.
It will be, what did it look like on January the 7th at 2 o'clock? And
correct.
You need to be able to demonstrate that consent that you hold is, what that consent was at that particular sort of date and time.
I have written a couple of articles, very, very, very concerned with the Quebec law as to how it's going to be applied. We haven't seen the regulations yet. We haven't seen any fines yet. So, and no guidance yet from the CAI. But all indications are, with only consent and contractual available to the marketplace, with very few other exceptions, this is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult for companies to legitimately use people's personal information.
Yeah.
Without consent or without them being a customer. So,
well,
as
a challenge.
As a traditional marketer, it looks to me like personalized marketing is going to be more for your existing customer base.
Yeah.
And the broader awareness, kind of bringing new customers in, you're not going to be able to use their personal information unless they give you consent. And I think consent for the next few years is going to be really hard to get, because the consumer doesn't trust us. We've had 25 years of bad behavior, right?
Well, I mean, it's like I said before, Derek, and we've spoken about this previously as well. The consumers are becoming more savvy about what their rights are and what to expect from an organisation. And one thing is certain, that legislation isn't going to get any looser. It's going to become more enforced and restricted, I think, in some verticals and some sectors. And you kind of need to start having that conversation with your customers now, really, rather than waiting until September of this year or September of next year, because there will be a clamour of people that get to the party late or get on the track late and are catching up. It's a real opportunity for organisations to look at consent now, or to look at Bill64 now, and start to have things in place so they're ahead of the curve, and they're not. You remember in the EU when the GDPR was enforcing or coming to be enforced, the amount of emails that were sent out by organisations looking to reconsent, when in fact in some instances they didn't need to gain that consent, but by mid-April everybody had switched off. Not another reconsent email from another organisation. I won't do anything. And in doing nothing, they were opted out of the database anyway. So I hate to use the phrase, it's a journey that you're going to have to go on, but it's exactly that. And if you haven't started it, it's not too late to start now. But if you have, then that's great, because it's coming. You're not going to be able to sort of, you need to have it in place as a Canadian business, because as you said at the start, 22% of the population reside in Quebec. So there's a chance that you have Quebec residents within your database if you're doing business in Canada.
Yeah, some of these requirements are actually exist in PEPITA today, but it's not really being enforced. PEPITA is although it's a law, it's more like a set of best practices. What the difference here is I believe, what all indications are, the CAI with their new enforcement powers are going to be very aggressive, and they are going to be looking. Now, the first pieces that come into force this September have nothing to do with the consent. So we've got a year and a bit.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But as you said earlier, it takes time to get a system in place and change your internal practices and write policies and procedures and do all of the things that a compliant program requires. That takes time. And like the GDPR, everybody kind of went, well, don't I get any warning? And it's like, well, no, you actually had a couple of years and you didn't take advantage of it. This bill was passed last September.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So it's been in the public sphere for.
And and helpfully, it outlines and gives you a timetable of what you need to have in place and when you need to have it in place.
It does, and I think that they've been very fair in their coming into force strategy. They gave a couple of lobs for this September, and and the bulk of the law will come into force next September, including all the consent pieces. So we have a question here. What are the steps that a business should take now to prepare for the introduction of the legislation in September 2023? So that's exactly what we're talking about. Is you need to be able to look at your current practices and do a gap report against the obligations of the law, of the new law, and find out where your practices are off and what change you have to put in place. It's a very pragmatic and straightforward operation, but as we said earlier regarding consent management, none of us have ever had to do it before, so most of us do not have a practice in that area. There is no process in place. So that's one that's going to show up on most organizations' gap reports when they compare themselves against Bill 64 compliance. They're going to realize that that's one of the gaps is they've got to put a consent management process in place. Do we know yet if there will be a exemption for nonprofits? Yes, there is, but it's like Castle, it's got some parameters around it. So there is a bit of a carve out for asking for donations, but it's not a free for all. There's also a B2B out. So under Quebec law, they consider your business email address, your business mailing address, and your business phone number, as well as your job title. They do not consider that personal information. So that is out of scope of the law. So there's a little B2B carve out, and there is a not-for-profit carve out. And if anybody would like to know the specifics of that, I'll be happy to respond, via email and give you the exact sections of the law that state those carve-outs.
Well,
all right.
We said we were going to keep it sort of people grabbing a coffee and a 30-minute chat. So
it's good. It's good.
And Natalie, there's everyone's firing questions in now, but we're planning on doing these grab a coffee 30-minute chats in the run up to the September, and I think sometime in June we're going to do a webinar about implementing a confidentiality incident reporting plan, and we've got lots of other exciting webinars lined up if that one doesn't interest you in terms of the subject matter. So Derek, thank you.
I thank you. I look forward to our next session, which is June 8th, and we'll be talking about implementing a confidentiality incident reporting plan. That is a major obligation for organizations of all sizes under Bill 64. If anybody would like to ask a specific question, I'll capture the questions out of this webinar, but please don't hesitate to email either David or I. My email address is dlackey, DLACKEY @newportthompson.com. And David, you might want to give yours if anybody has any specific questions.
David.McInerney, which is McInerney at Serenis, which is SYRENIS.com.
So please,
maybe we'll put our email addresses up on the panel invite for next time, Derek. So it's an evolving process.
I will send an email to everybody with a follow-up with our contact information.
Good idea.
And if you have any specific questions, yes, I do have a copy of the English law that integrates the 2007 version with the Bill 64 changes to have a new English summary of the PPIPS. So if anybody wants that, again, I'll give you a link. I'll give you a way to get that from me if you wish. So thank you. Enjoy your lunch.
Cheers, Derek. See ya.
Ciao.